The story of the Vikings is often told in fragments, as if they were raiders who came and went with the tide, vanishing after setting fire to villages and monasteries. But the truth is far deeper, and their story is stitched together not only by the sails of their longships, but also by the blood spilled in battles that changed the course of nations. To understand these battles, we must not see them as random acts of violence, but rather as turning points where courage, strategy, fear, and survival met on fields, rivers, and coastlines. Imagine yourself standing in that world, where the air carried the smell of smoke from burning wood, where the sea could bring either fortune or ruin, and where a single clash of swords might decide the fate of generations. This is not a story of disconnected fights, but a living chain of events, and today we will walk through it together, not as distant historians, but as witnesses. The tale begins in the late 8th century, in the year 793, on a remote island, off the northeast coast of England called Lindisfarne. The monastery there stood like a peaceful beacon, a place where monks prayed, studied, and copied holy texts. They believed themselves protected by God and distance alike. But that illusion shattered when Viking longships cut through the waves and struck with the precision of a hawk diving on prey. The battle itself was brief, for the monks were no warriors, but the raid sent a shock across Europe. To the people of Christendom, it felt as though demons had poured from the sea, men who laughed as they cut down holy servants and carried away gold, books, and captives. To the Vikings, this was not simply an act of cruelty, but a test of strength, a declaration that no shore was safe, and that their reach would stretch far beyond the fjords of Norway. Though not a great battle in the traditional sense, Lindisfarne was the first strike of a hammer that would pound across Europe, and it changed history by announcing the arrival of a new power. From there, the Norse tide spread. The raids grew larger, and villages and kingdoms realized that these were not passing storms, but organized warriors who came with purpose. We must now move to the early 9th century, where the clash between the Vikings and the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne became a struggle of two worlds. Charlemagne had forged a mighty empire that stood as the guardian of Western Christendom, and he viewed the Northmen as both a threat and a puzzle. To him, they were pagans who defied the cross, yet they were also skilled sailors and traders, able to move faster than his armies could react. In 810, a fleet of Danish Vikings struck Frisia, seeking control of the rich trade routes, and Charlemagne was forced to send armies to defend his lands. These battles were not just about territory, but about identity. The Franks sought to impose order, while the Vikings thrived in chaos. The clashes here laid the foundation for future conflicts, for the Vikings learned how to fight great armies, and the Franks learned that even an empire could bleed when struck at the edges. But the true weight of Viking battles would be felt on the British Isles, where kingdoms rose and fell like waves on a restless sea. By the middle of the 9th century, a storm unlike any before it came crashing down: the Great Heathen Army. This was no small raiding party, but a coalition of Viking warriors from Denmark, Norway, and perhaps even Sweden, who crossed the north sea in 865 with the intent not only to raid, but to conquer. The reasons were many: wealth, revenge, the hunger for land. But one story speaks louder than the rest: the tale of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar had been captured by the Northumbrian king Ella and thrown into a pit of snakes, dying in torment, and his sons swore vengeance. Whether this story is legend or truth, the fact remains that the Viking host swept across England with a fury no one had seen before. They captured York, one of the greatest cities of Northumbria, in 866, turning it into a base of operations. The battle for York was bloody, and the fall of the city shattered Northumbrian power, sending ripples through all of England. At this point, the English kingdoms realized they faced not raiders, but conquerors. Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex All stood in their path. East Anglia fell quickly, and its king was said to have been martyred when he refused to renounce his faith. Mercia too was battered into submission, leaving only Wessex, the last kingdom standing. And here we meet one of the most remarkable figures in history, Alfred, later called the Great. Alfred was not born into easy times. He inherited a kingdom on the edge of collapse, pressed hard by Viking armies who seemed unstoppable. Yet he would rise not through brute force, but through patience, strategy, and the ability to adapt. The battles between Alfred's Wessex and the Viking forces became some of the defining struggles of the age, battles that would determine whether England would exist at all. One of the most crucial of these clashes was the Battle of Edington in 878. The Viking leader Guthrum had forced Alfred into hiding, driving him into the marshes of Somerset, where it seemed all was lost. Imagine Alfred there, a king without a throne, his people scattered, his land burning, yet he did not surrender. Instead, he rebuilt, calling loyal men to him, training them, and preparing for a decisive strike. When the two forces met at Edington, it was more than a fight for land, it was a fight for the soul of England. The battle raged, shield walls slamming together, axes and swords cutting through the air, until finally Alfred's men broke the Viking line. Guthrum was forced not only to surrender, but to accept baptism, a symbolic act that marked the beginning of a new balance of power. England would not fall, and the Vikings, though still strong, were forced to settle as rulers rather than destroyers. From this moment, the Danelaw was born, a region of England under Viking control, and the land was divided between Norse and Saxon. Yet the Viking story is not only about defeat or victory, it is about transformation. By the 10th century, battles continued across the British Isles, but the Norse also began to weave themselves into the fabric of the lands they conquered. Dublin became a great Viking city, a hub of trade and power, while in Scotland and Ireland, Norse and local clans battled for dominance, shaping the culture and politics of the region. But beyond the Isles, the Vikings were turning their eyes elsewhere, to the rivers of the east, to lands rich in silver, furs and power. Here their battles would not only be against enemies with swords, but against the very elements of geography and ambition. In the lands that would one day be called Russia, Viking warriors, known as Varangians, sailed along the great rivers, the Volga and the Dnieper. They established trade routes and towns, clashing with Slavic tribes and steppe nomads, forging a new identity as rulers of what became the Kievan Rus. Their battles here were not just about plunder, but about creating kingdoms, and their influence would echo into the foundation of nations. At the same time, other Norse warriors traveled south, serving as mercenaries in Constantinople, where the Byzantine emperors recruited them as the feared Varangian Guard. These warriors, wielding massive axes, fought in battles far from the fjords, becoming legends in lands that had never seen snow. Still, the Viking story circles back to the west, where the greatest clash of all awaited, the struggle for England in the 11th century. A struggle that would culminate in one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But before Hastings came another test, a final blaze of Viking power in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In September of that year, King Harald Hardrada of Norway sailed with a massive army to claim the English throne. His reputation was fearsome, a warrior who had fought across the known world, and his fleet struck fear into the English countryside. Yet at Stamford Bridge, he was met by King Harald Godwinson, who marched his men at great speed to surprise the Norse. The battle was fierce, axes and swords cutting through armor, and though the Vikings fought with the bravery of their ancestors, they were overwhelmed. Harald Hardrada fell, and with him fell the last great Viking attempt to conquer England. Only weeks later, Harald Godwinson himself would die at Hastings, and the Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, would reshape the island forever. The battles of the 9th century had already reshaped the British Isles and scarred the lands of the Franks. But the Viking world was never one to rest quietly after victory. They were a people restless by nature, guided by winds and opportunity, and wherever their longships sailed, war followed in their wake. As the 10th century dawned, the Norse warriors no longer appeared only as raiders, but as lords, settlers and rulers, carving their influence into every shore they touched. Yet their identity was still forged by battle, and it was in these struggles that the Viking spirit either triumphed or was broken. In England, the uneasy peace born after Alfred's victories was fragile, like ice stretched across a thawing river. The Danelaw had been established, giving the Vikings control over vast northern and eastern lands, while the Saxons clung to Wessex and slowly expanded their influence. The line between these two worlds was not simply a border on a map, but a living tension, where fields, villages and rivers became contested ground. From this tension rose another series of clashes that would echo through time, because even after Alfred's death, his descendants carried on his fight to unite England. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter Ethelfled, known as the Lady of the Mercians, carried forward the dream of resistance against Norse domination. The Vikings, for their part, did not simply vanish into farming. They gathered armies again and again, launching raids, seizing strongholds, and testing the Saxon resolve. Every clash between them was a question. Would England fall back into Norse hands, or would the Saxon crown endure? One of the most remarkable aspects of this age was how battles were fought, not just with swords and shields, but with fortresses and cunning. The Saxons, learning from bitter experience, began to build a network of fortified towns called burhs, strongholds that could resist Viking attacks and protect trade routes. This strategy shifted the balance, for the Vikings, who once thrived on swift strikes and open-field battles, now found themselves frustrated by walls and organized defense. Yet, when they gathered in force, they were still a storm to be feared. Battles in this era often blurred the line between raid and war, with fleets appearing on rivers like phantom armies, striking deep into the land, then vanishing before retaliation could gather. But when the armies met in open ground, it was the shield wall that decided fate. Picture it. Two masses of men pressing forward, shields locked tight, the clash of iron on wood ringing in the air, spears thrusting through gaps, axes swinging down with crushing force. It was not the quick flash of swordplay often imagined, but a grinding struggle, a test of endurance where those who broke first sealed their own doom. While England fought to balance between Saxon and Norse across the sea in Ireland, the Vikings were weaving yet another story. There, Norse warriors had not only raided, but founded entire towns, the greatest of which was Dublin. This city became a hub of power, a gateway between Scandinavia and the Celtic lands, and its kings were fierce contenders in the endless rivalries of Irish chieftains. Battles here were not just Norse against Irish, but shifting alliances where Vikings sometimes fought alongside local clans against rival groups, and then turned their blades against yesterday's friends. One of the most famous confrontations came in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, though we will walk there later in the tale, for it marked a turning point not only in Irish history, but in the Viking presence in the West. For now, it is enough to know that in these centuries, Viking power was not fading but adapting, becoming more complex, more tied to the politics of the lands they once only plundered. Beyond the western seas, however, the Viking hunger for wealth and renown was driving them ever farther into the heart of Europe. The rivers of Francia, which had once seemed like paths of easy plunder, were now guarded by fortresses, yet the Norse did not abandon their ambitions. Instead, they struck with greater force, leading to some of the most dramatic sieges of the age. One of these came in 845, when a fleet of Danish Vikings under Ragnar Perhaps the same figure of saga fame sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris itself. Imagine the sight. Dozens of longships crowding the river, their dragon-proud hulls dark against the water, warriors pouring onto the banks with shields glinting in the spring sun. The Frankish king, Charles the Bold, found himself trapped, unable to drive them back, and was forced to pay a massive ransom in silver to see them leave. But the lesson the Vikings learned was clear. If they could not always conquer by sword, they could bleed kingdoms with fear, extracting wealth not just through plunder, but through tribute. These payments, called Danegeld, became a grim tax on many European realms, a way to buy a temporary peace from the storm. Yet the French were not the only ones to face Viking ambition in this way. Across the Channel, the kings of England too would eventually find themselves paying Danegeld to stave off destruction, a policy that bought time but weakened resolve. It was a dangerous bargain, for while it spared lives in the short term, it taught the Norse that persistence could be as rewarding as bloodshed. The rhythm of battle and tribute became a cycle that defined much of the later Viking Age, where swords and silver worked together as weapons of conquest. Still, the Vikings were not always content with silver alone. Their eyes turned to land, to permanent dominion, and nowhere was this more evident than in the creation of Normandy. In 911, after years of war, a Viking leader named Rollo made peace with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. He accepted baptism and land along the lower Seine in exchange for defending it from other raiders. What began as a treaty of survival became the foundation of a new power. The Norse settlers in Normandy slowly adopted the French language and customs, blending Viking ferocity with Frankish order. Their descendants would one day ride to England not as raiders but as conquerors in 1066, proving that Viking battles did not end with the clash of blades but lived on in the legacies of those who followed. Meanwhile, in the east, the Norse were carving out yet another chapter. The rivers of Russia became the veins of a new realm, and here the Vikings, known as Varangians, fought battles not only against hostile tribes but against the currents of empire itself. Their clashes with the Khazars, the Pechenegs, and other steppe peoples tested their endurance in ways the Western raids never had. The story of the Rus attack on Constantinople in 860 is one of audacity almost unmatched. A fleet of Norse warriors sailed through the Black Sea and struck the walls of the Byzantine capital, sending the mighty empire into panic. Though the attack ultimately failed to break the city, it shocked the world that men from the far north could strike at the very heart of one of the greatest powers of the age. The Byzantines would never again underestimate them, and in time, many of these same Vikings would serve as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard, standing as elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor himself. It was a strange irony that men, who once tried to sack the city, would later die defending it. All of these battles, on rivers, coasts, and fields, were shaping not only the destiny of kingdoms, but the very identity of the Viking world. By the mid-10th century, they were no longer just raiders but rulers, no longer strangers but part of the lands they had once terrorized. Yet their spirit was unchanged. Whether on the fields of England, in the cities of Ireland, along the Seine, or beneath the walls of Constantinople, the Vikings remained bound by the same thread. The belief that life was fleeting, that honor was won in battle, and that death itself was but another voyage to a greater haul beyond. This belief drove them to risk everything, to sail farther, to fight harder, and to carve their names into the memory of history. The memory of earlier victories carried the Vikings far into the later centuries of their age, but so too did the sting of defeats shape their next moves. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Norse were no longer only an outside force crashing against Europe's shores. They were woven deeply into its struggles, its kingships, and its rivalries. Some of the most decisive battles of this later period were not merely raids, but campaigns of conquest and kingship, where the fate of entire realms shifted because of Viking ambition and resilience. It was no longer enough to plunder and leave. The dream of ruling entire kingdoms now burned in their hearts. England once again stood as the great stage where these ambitions clashed most fiercely. For centuries the Saxons had fought, bled, and sacrificed to resist Norse invasion, yet still the dragon-proud ships returned. The greatest of these challenges came during the reign of Ethelred, remembered bitterly in history as Ethelred the Unready. His reign was marked by indecision and by the devastating onslaughts of Viking armies who sensed weakness and pressed it without mercy. Raids came with such force and frequency that whole regions were emptied, villages burned, and monasteries reduced to ash. Desperate for relief, Ethelred turned to the familiar solution of Danegeld, paying immense sums of silver to the Norse, in hope of peace. But as had been learned before, silver bought only time, never safety. Every tribute fed the hunger for more, and each new demand grew heavier. England seemed caught in an endless cycle, and the people began to despair. It was in this crucible of fear that one of the boldest Viking leaders rose to prominence, Svein Forkbeard of Denmark. Svein was a warrior king who understood both the battlefield and the throne, and his gaze fixed on England not just as a land to raid, but as a crown to claim. His campaigns were ruthless, driving deeper and deeper until even London itself trembled. The sight of his armies pressing along the Thames, ships bristling with warriors, must have filled the Saxons with dread, for they knew this was no passing raid. Svein meant to rule. By 1013, his power was so overwhelming that Ethelred fled into exile, leaving the kingdom in Viking hands. For the first time, a Norse king had claimed all of England, and though Svein's reign was brief, he died the following year. The achievement shook the world. The question now was not whether Vikings could win battles, but whether they could wear crowns. The answer came in the figure of Svein's son, Cnut the Great. If Svein's conquest had been a storm, Cnut's reign was a settled season of power. Cnut not only held England through force of arms, but also wove it into a North Sea empire, linking it with Denmark and later Norway. His victories were not just on the battlefield, but in the halls of governance, where he balanced Saxon traditions with Norse strength, binding the land in loyalty. Yet his empire had been born in blood, and battles remained its foundation. To secure his throne, Cnut had to crush rivals, drive off challenges, and prove again and again that the Viking way of the sword could sustain a kingdom. His reign marked a turning point, for it showed that the Vikings were no longer just outsiders. They were kings within Europe itself. While England wrestled with this age of conquest, the Irish shores were preparing for one of the most dramatic battles in Viking history. For generations, Dublin had been a Norse stronghold, a centre of trade and power, and its rulers sought to dominate the patchwork of Irish kingdoms around them. But Ireland was a land of fierce independence, and no ruler could claim it without facing rivals. The tension finally broke in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, a clash that gathered not only Irish clans but Viking warbands from across the sea. On one side stood Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, determined to break Norse power once and for all. On the other were the Dublin Norse and their allies, equally determined to preserve their hold. The battle raged on Good Friday, and the fields near Dublin became a storm of shields, spears, and cries. The fighting was so fierce that even sagas struggled to capture its full fury, but the outcome was clear. Though Brian Boru fell, his forces shattered the strength of Dublin's Norse, ending their dream of ruling Ireland. Clontarf did not erase the Viking presence entirely, but it broke their grip on power, marking one of the great turning points of their age. Farther east, the Viking spirit was also being tested in lands beyond the western seas. The Varangians, who had carved their way through Russia, continued to play a decisive role in the fate of empires. Their river routes brought them wealth through trade and plunder, but also peril through endless warfare. In the south, the Byzantine Empire drew them into service, turning their warriors into the famed Varangian Guard. These men, wielding their great two-handed axes, fought not for their own kings, but for the emperors of Constantinople, becoming legendary for their loyalty and ferocity. On the battlefields of the East, Viking blood spilled not for sagas of plunder, but for the survival of an empire older than their own. It was a strange transformation, yet one more sign that the Norse were no longer just raiders, but a people whose martial skill was sought by kings across the known world. And still, even in their service abroad, the Vikings carried their own stories of glory and loss. Some found their way into Byzantine chronicles, tales of northern warriors who stood unflinching even when empires trembled. For those who returned home, the wealth they carried and the tales they told added to the legend of their people, binding their fate not only to Scandinavia, but to every corner of Europe where they had fought. The battles of this era showed that the Viking story was not fading, but spreading, entangling itself with the histories of every realm it touched. By the middle of the 11th century, however, the age of Viking domination was drawing toward its close. Yet before the curtain fell, there would be one last surge of fury, one last wave of battles that would leave a mark greater than any before. For across the sea, in the year 1066, the Norse would once again stake everything on the battlefield, and the outcome would shape not just their fate, but the destiny of kingdoms for centuries to come. The year 1066 looms in every account of the Viking Age, not only because it brought the end of Norse power in England, but because it became the stage for one of the most dramatic sequences of battles in all medieval history. By then, nearly 3 centuries of Viking raids, conquests, and kingships had reshaped the north. Generations of Norse warriors had fought across Europe, and their descendants now stood as rulers and nobles in the very lands their ancestors once plundered. Yet, in that single year, the destiny of England would be tested by 3 rival claims to its crown, and at the heart of it, the last great Viking attempt to seize a kingdom through the sword. The story begins with the death of King Edward, the Confessor of England, in January 1066. His passing left no clear heir, and the kingdom, long battered by invasions and shifting alliances, became a prize sought by 3 powerful men. Harald Godwinson, the leading English noble and brother-in-law of Edward, seized the throne with the support of the Witan, England's Council of Nobles. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier and prepared to enforce his right by invasion. And then came Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, the last great Viking warrior king, who declared that he too had a rightful claim, one rooted in treaties and old agreements. Each man believed his cause was just, but history would remember that only one would hold England when the year ended. For the English, Harald Godwinson faced an impossible task. He had to guard against William's planned invasion from the south, while also bracing for Hardrada's arrival from the north. The Norse king was no minor raider. Harald Hardrada was a veteran of countless wars, a man who had fought in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, a commander who had known both exile and triumph. His name meant the hard ruler, and he lived up to it. His dream of adding England to his realm was no reckless adventure. It was the final ambition of a warrior who had spent his life chasing glory. With him sailed thousands of warriors and hundreds of ships, joined by Tostig, Harald Godwinson's exiled brother, who sought vengeance against his own kin. When Hardrada landed in the north of England in September, he struck swiftly. The Norse army clashed with English forces at Fulford, near York, where two earls, Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia, tried to block his advance. The battle was fierce and bloody, fought in marshland that turned the clash into a nightmare of drowning men, broken shield walls, and desperate charges. Hardrada's veterans proved too strong, and the English earls were crushed. York submitted soon after, and for a moment it seemed as though the Viking king had seized his prize. But fate was not yet finished. Harald Hardrada marched his army north in a desperate bid to save his kingdom. In a feat of speed and endurance that would be remembered for centuries, he covered nearly 200 miles in less than a week, his men driven forward by the knowledge that England hung in the balance. When he reached Stamford Bridge on September 25th, he found Hardrada's army caught off guard. The Vikings had not expected Harald's arrival so soon, and many were without armor, resting in the late September sun. What followed was a battle that has lived in legend. The clash at Stamford Bridge was brutal. At first the Norse rallied, their warriors forming a shield wall as they always had, their axes biting into English ranks. One saga tells of a lone Viking holding the bridge itself, cutting down dozens of Englishmen before he was finally overcome. But despite their courage, the Viking army was unprepared for such a sudden attack. The heat of the day, the exhaustion of the march from Fulford, and the sheer weight of Harald's assault broke their strength. Harald Hardrada himself fell in the fighting, struck by an arrow to the throat. His ally Tostig also died, and the great Viking dream of conquering England ended on that field. The battle was not just another defeat, it was the final great battle fought by a Viking king. The Norse who survived were allowed to leave, but of the hundreds of ships that had carried them across the sea, only a fraction sailed home. The Viking Age, in many ways, died with Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, though its echo would be heard again just days later. For Harald Hardrada, though victorious, had no time to rest. Even as the blood dried on the fields of Yorkshire, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast. Harald was forced to turn his weary army around, marching once again across England, to face a new invader. That march ended at Hastings on October 14, 1066. There, on a ridge overlooking the Sussex countryside, Harold's tired warriors faced William's Normans, a force of cavalry, archers, and infantry that combined both Viking and Frankish traditions. The battle lasted all day, with Harold's shield wall holding against repeated Norman assaults. Time and again, the English beat back their foes, and for hours it seemed as though Harald might win. But William's persistence, his use of feigned retreats to lure the English from their strong line, and the exhaustion of Harold's army slowly turned the tide. As dusk fell, Harald was killed, whether by an arrow through the eye, as tradition says, or by Norman swords, no one can be certain. With his death, the English army broke, and William claimed victory. The Norman conquest was not a Viking triumph, yet it carried the Norse legacy forward in a strange way. The Normans themselves were descended from Vikings who had settled in France generations earlier, and in their armies one could still see echoes of the old Norse ways of war. In this sense, the Vikings did not vanish in 1066. They transformed, passing their warrior spirit into new dynasties and new realms. Yet for Scandinavia, Stamford Bridge was the final chapter of conquest abroad. The great age of Viking battles was over. Even so, the memory of those battles lived on. In sagas sung by skalds, in chronicles written by monks, in the scars left on landscapes from York to Paris, their legacy remained. They had begun as raiders on fragile ships, striking at unguarded coasts. But over 3 centuries they had fought battles that reshaped kingdoms, toppled rulers, and forged empires. From Lindisfarne to Stamford Bridge, the path of Viking steel left its mark upon history, and though the age had ended, the world that followed could never forget them. When the dust of Hastings settled and William of Normandy claimed his crown, the age of Viking invasions had closed. Yet the story of Viking battles did not end with one man's death on a blood-soaked field. Instead, the final legacy of those centuries of war was carried into the kingdoms that rose afterward, shaping law, language, power, and memory. The Viking world had been a storm that swept across Europe, and though the storm now calmed, its thunder still echoed in every realm it had touched. For the people of Scandinavia, the great overseas adventures that had defined their forefathers gave way to something new. Kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden no longer dreamed of conquering England or raiding Paris, but instead sought to strengthen their rule at home. These were lands that had been fractured by clan rivalries and jarls for generations. Yet the wealth and experience gained from centuries of raiding created the foundations for stronger monarchies. What had once been warbands gathering for plunder slowly transformed into kingdoms ruled by dynasties that could claim descent from legendary warriors. But the memory of battles fought abroad lingered, woven into the sagas told by poets around the fire. They spoke of Ragnar Lothbrok, whose sons stormed across England in the Great Heathen Army, of Guthrum, who fought Alfred the Great and carved out a Norse realm in the Danelaw, of Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Hardrada, who fought to Christianize Norway with both sword and sermon, of Cnut the Great, who ruled an empire across the North Sea with a strength that even the Holy Roman Emperor respected, and of Harald Hardrada, whose fall at Stamford Bridge marked the twilight of the Viking age. These men, half remembered in myth and history, became the heroes of a culture that turned from battlefields to manuscripts, carving their memories not only into stone, but into words that still endure. The truth of their battles was never forgotten by those who faced them. In the monasteries of England, monks who had once feared the sight of dragon-prowed ships recorded the devastations of raids, the terror of burning churches, and the years when whole regions fell to Viking rulers. In Francia, the memory of Viking sieges haunted kings for generations, shaping military reforms and castle building that defined medieval Europe. Even in the Byzantine Empire, where Varangian guards stood tall in their winged helmets, the reputation of Norse warriors lived on as men who were loyal, fierce, and unbreakable in combat. Yet, as centuries passed, something remarkable happened. The very battles that once brought terror and destruction were reshaped into stories of bravery and adventure. Where once the name Viking meant raider, foreigner, and enemy, it slowly came to mean explorer, trader, and even ancestor. The battles remained violent and bloody in the telling, but they were remembered less as scars and more as origins. In Iceland, skalds wrote of the duels of Egil Skallagrimsson and the feuds of Njal and his kin. In Norway and Denmark, royal genealogies traced their legitimacy to kings who had once swung axes in the conquest of England. Even in Normandy, William's victory at Hastings was seen as the ultimate proof that the descendants of Vikings had not only survived, but triumphed. Still, one cannot overlook the cost. For every saga of glory, there were families who lost sons to foreign seas, villages that burned, and kingdoms that crumbled. The Viking Age was not a romantic adventure for those who lived through it. It was a time when steel and fire decided the fate of thousands. The battles that changed history did so not because of their heroics, but because they shifted the balance of power across Europe. Without Lindisfarne, perhaps the Norse would never have been feared raiders. Without the Great Heathen Army, perhaps England would never have forged unity under Alfred and his heirs. Without Stiklestad, Norway might have resisted Christianity far longer. Without Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the political map of northern Europe might have remained scattered, its future uncertain. By the 12th century, the Viking way of war had become part of history rather than the present. The longships that once struck terror into coasts now served merchants and fishermen. The shield walls gave way to knights and castles. Yet, the legacy of those battles lived in law codes, place names, and cultural memory. The Norse brought not only destruction, but also systems of trade, settlement, and governance that outlasted their swords. Towns like Dublin, York, and Kiev had been Viking strongholds, and long after the warriors were gone, those cities thrived as centers of commerce. And so the story of Viking battles ends not on the battlefield itself, but in the transformation they left behind. The Norse had been raiders, conquerors, and kings, but they had also been settlers, farmers, and rulers. The battles they fought changed not only the fates of kings, but the very structure of medieval Europe. Their victories and defeats alike became the foundation of new realms that carried their bloodlines and their traditions into the centuries that followed. The age of Viking battles ended, but their spirit remained alive. In every saga retold, in every rune stone carved, in every memory of ships upon the sea, the warriors of the North continued to live. And though the world moved on, their battles remained as milestones of history, moments when the clash of axes and the roar of shield walls reshaped nations, altered destinies, and left behind a legacy that no winter, no storm, and no passing age could ever erase. The story of the Vikings is not only one of raids and conquests, it is a story of how people fought, lost, adapted, and endured. Their battles were chapters in a larger saga of human survival, ambition, and change. And when we look back on them, now across 1,000 years, we do not only see blood and steel, we see the making of a world that still remembers their name.